So hello, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you very warmly to the international book launch of Yasmeen Lari, Architecture for the Future, edited by Angelika Fitz, Elke Krasny, Mario Mazar, and Architekturzentrum Wien, and published by MIT Press. We, the editors, are very happy to present this book today. The book celebrates the work of Yasmeen Lari and uses Lari's work as an example to show how the relationship of architecture to the future has changed. Leni, would you? Yes, thank you. Maybe show the second slide, please, the next one, Leni. Thanks. This slide gives you an overview of our program for the next hour. We will give an introduction to the book first and share the motivations behind it. Contributing authors Anne Karp, Chris Moffat, and Mario Mazar, who is of course also co-editor, will share their insights on the context of Yasmeen Lari's work. And of course, we are overjoyed that Yasmeen Lari is here with us today, live on Zoom, and will give a short lecture at the end. And we also have to take into account, and we are very happy that Yasmeen Lari and Mario Mazar, they are with us from Karachi today, and they are with us despite a very erratic situation currently. And maybe the internet will also be weak at sometimes or erratic sometimes, but let's hope for the best. So thanks a lot, a special thanks to both of them for joining us today. Next slide, please. So my name is Angelika Fitz. I'm the director of the Architekturzentrum Wien, which is the Austrian Museum for Architecture. And in this case, I'm also one of the editors and co-curators of Yasmeen Lari, Architecture for the Future. Why a book on Yasmeen Lari now? Yasmeen Lari is Pakistan's first female architect. She designed iconic modernist buildings before initiating the world's largest zero-carbon self-build movement. The fact that she now receives the gold medal of the Royal Institute is fantastic, of course, and it fills us with great joy. But of course, this was not foreseeable for us. The plans for an exhibition and a book on Yasmeen Lari go back several years, as working on decarbonization and dekolonialization is critical to our work at the museum. And I'm most delighted that Yasmeen Lari agreed to this project and that she is with us today. Yasmeen, it's your inspirational work that makes it possible to claim that there is, in fact, an architecture for the future. We thank you for your trust that made this book possible, for opening your archives, and for countless conversations. Already in 2019, Elke Krasny and I featured one example of Yasmeen Lari's work in our book, Critical Care, Architecture and Urbanism for a Broken Planet, also published with MIT Press. That was when we first introduced an ethics of care into the architectural discourse. Back then, we began to think about a book and an exhibition dedicated to Yasmeen Lari's work. Due to pandemic conditions, our research travel to Karachi had to be postponed until the beginning of last year. During that period, Mario Mazar joined the editorial and curatorial team. And finally, in February 2022, we were all able to meet in Karachi. My deep thanks goes to my co-editors, Elke and Marvi, and to all authors contributing to the book. Elke will introduce them shortly. And another big thanks go to Alexander Schuh for the graphic design and to Agnes Wiskitensky for the project coordination. So what is this book about? On the one hand, it's a comprehensive monography on Yasmeen Lari. It contains previously unpublished photographic and plan material from the Architects' Archive. Born in 1941 in what is today Pakistan, then still under British rule, Lari received her architectural training in England. In 1964, she was the first woman to open an architectural office in Pakistan. She designed Pakistan's first social housing complex in Lahore and landmark buildings such as the Pakistan State Oil headquarters in Karachi. Her own house, an icon of brutalism, brought her international fame. At the same time, she began to investigate local building traditions. Together with her husband, Suhail Lari, she founded the Heritage Foundation of Pakistan and researched and saved the built heritage of her country, the two World Heritage Sites in Makli and Lahore, as well as everyday buildings. Since 2005, Lari has been redefining architecture as climate activism. In Pakistan, one of the countries hardest hit by climate catastrophe, she initiated the world's largest zero-carbon self-built movement. Tens of thousands of flood and earthquake-proof houses, sanitary infrastructure, smokeless stoves, and community facilities made out of zero-carbon materials such as bamboo and mud were self-constructed accordingly to her plans by people who had lost their homes, many of them among the landless poor. This work has also been honored with international awards in recent years. In 2016, Lara received the Fukuoka Art and Cultural Prize, in 2020, the Jane Drew Prize, and in 2021, an honorary doctorate from the Politecnico di Milano, as the first woman, one has to say. And most recently, of course, as mentioned, now the Royal Gold Medal of the River. She currently holds the Marshall Professorship for Sustainable Design at the University of Cambridge. Next slide, please. It's really a most impressive life and career, but the book is much more than a monograph. Yasmeen Lari gives us a reason to rethink the relationship between architecture and the future. So that's one of a quote of her, which we also use in the book and the exhibition. We have to rethink everything, and we have to do it now. The book uses her oeuvre as an example to show how the relationship of architecture to the future has changed. It asks questions that point far beyond Lari's work. How does architecture build the future? How radically must architecture change for us to still have a future? Modernist architecture asserted the claim to build a better future. Today, we are living with the aftermath of this building. The global construction sector, with its enormous carbon emissions, and even the globalized aid industry are partly responsible for the climate catastrophe. Well, for me, as the director of an architecture museum, Yasmeen Lari Architecture for the Future is to contribute to a different understanding of architecture. An architectural history that is not Western and male-dominated, and an architectural practice that cares for people and nature, for social and ecological justice. Of course, such a practice will find locally situated answers in specific contexts, from building differently with low-carbon materials or the circular economy to no longer erecting new structures and working with adaptive reuse. Yasmeen Lari's stance and her systemic way of working is for sure outstanding in this most needed paradigm shift. With this book, the Architekturzentrum Wien wants to make an active contribution to ensuring that we don't give up the possibility of a future. And a fantastic partner in this endeavor was, or still is, MIT Press. And at this point, Victoria Hindley from MIT Press wanted to speak to us. Unfortunately, she is unable to attend, and she sends us the following statement, which I will now read out to you. Next slide, please. Quote, "Material culture has always been inscribed with power. My work as a commissioning editor is guided by a long-standing commitment to examining who has access to that power, who does not, and why. Yasmeen Lari's vital work upends the long-standing power relationships that have driven architecture and urbanism to demonstrate not only why we must do things differently, but how to do so on the ground, in real life, today. This generous book reminds us why it is critical to understand the ethical, social, and environmental impact inherent in our built environments, and demands that we all become activists for change. Victoria Hindley from MIT Press. And at this point now, I will, in this moment, hand over to my co-editor and co-curator, Elke Krasny, professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna.
Also, a warm welcome from my side. I will just take a second to share the screen and to continue where Angelika has left off. So a book, as we all know, can be an agent to help us think with, and also a way of celebrating, collecting, and bringing together what we call a life's work. So a book can help us to be, as Angelika said, a monograph, but it can also at the same time be a polygraph, so written by many different people from different perspectives and from their knowledge positions and also life experiences. Today, the words decolonizing, decarbonizing are used widely. The word depatriarchalizing is not used so much, harder to say. But I think in relation to Yasmeen Lari's work, these terms are not just terms, but they have actually become something that is being put into architecture and into practice. Currently, when Yasmeen Lari's work is celebrated because of the recent recognition with the RIBA Gold Medal, we hear a lot about her humanitarian work. But Angelika, Marvi, and myself think that it's precisely because of all the earlier work she has done that she was able to do what she is doing now. So we don't want to split a life's work in something that is now considered no longer of relevance or of importance, but quite the contrary. Because of the fact that people have been doing one thing in the past, they can do another thing in the present and in the future. And therefore, we see the book as a tool that helps us learn to unlearn and learn to relearn at the same time. So I will briefly let you take a look at the table of contents. I will not read it out loud, but it serves here to show how a monograph, Yasmeen Lari Projects, Contexts, Concerns, written by Angelika, Marvi, and myself, is being brought together with the second part of the book, essays that examine Yasmeen Lari's work in context, in the context of Pakistan, in the context of a changing world because of climate change, in the context of lack of housing, in the context of what Yasmeen calls essentials. And these perspectives help us place her work in relation to other architectures of care, but also help us learn what it means that architecture schools need different books like this one, as I want to argue, in order to work with students on different architectures for a different future. One of the sentences that I've been quoting many times because I love it so much is this one: we must tread lightly on the planet. Because this sentence inspires hope. It's not about giving up the planet, but it says what is here, the given, has to be taken into account carefully. And knowing this, we need to tread lightly. The first part of the book, Projects, Contexts, and Concerns, is a chronological overview. And I will just show you some of the images, key images that allow for readers to understand how Yasmeen Lari's work unfolded over time, and how we as editors and writers use the means of description in order to bring together facts, information, but also analysis. Starting from Karachi modernism, post-colonial living, and Yasmeen Lari's own house, we move on to housing equality, to social housing, that in her work brings together innovating modernism and tradition. So that may sound a bit strange at first, but what we want to say is that both modernism and tradition at the same time are being innovated by how Yasmeen Lari has approached social housing in terms of building materials, but also in terms of the spatial organization of housing. It's not only at the scale of housing and housing infrastructure that Yasmeen Lari has been active, but she also has a period in her life which she refers to as her star architecture period. And during that time, in the 1980s and 1990s, she realized large-scale buildings along a Karachi boulevard, a mainstream traffic artery. And these buildings are still considered icons, and people who live in Karachi, a 22 million inhabitant city, know and recognize the work of the architect along this boulevard. Early on, Yasmeen Lari started to work with local materials and to establish a different relationship between material ecologies and also a deep understanding of heritage and how the local is being built. In her case, heritage has to be understood in relation to the future, in particular in an approach that emphasizes that legacies need to be decolonized in order to be recognized for what they are and taken with us into the present time. So heritage not relevant as heritage per se, but as something to be invested in, to be used, lived with, and learned from. Yasmeen Lari is not only an architect who builds buildings and establishes different economies as she does now, but she has also always built new laws, policies, institutions, and has networked widely across South Asia, Muslim countries, the Asian context, but also at the level of the UN and transnationally. And her work as a humanitarian worker, the architect becoming a humanitarian worker, has started after the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan and has since continued, I would say, relentlessly, tirelessly, and insistently, insisting that dignity of life relies on a zero carbon revolution in architecture so that we no longer harm the planet, but also essentials for life, which include housing/shelter, drinking water, safe toilets, stoves and cooking facilities to prepare food, but also places for community gathering and sociability, because as human beings, we are not beings in isolation, but we only exist with each other and in interdependence and exchange. And for that, we need space in order to come together, gather together, and exchange. So this is probably the quote Angelica Marvi and myself love the most. We have to rethink everything, and we have to do it now. And in a way, it's like an imperative. Rethinking everything and then acting upon it means that there have to be consequences resulting from one's thinking. It is now my pleasure to introduce the three out of the many authors who have contributed to the book, who are with us today and will share from their essays and their work. And I will briefly introduce each one of them before they present their slides and share their perspectives. Chris Moffat is a political and intellectual historian of modern South Asia And we were introduced to him by Madhi Mazar, who made the connection to him. And we are very lucky, we can consider ourselves lucky, that he agreed to write on Yasmeen Lari's work in the context of post-partition Pakistan and how a new modern Pakistan was being built. And I now give the word to you, Chris.
Thanks. Thanks, Elke, and thanks also to Angelica and Marvi and the team in Vienna. It's a real privilege to be here. Also express gratitude to Yasmeen Lari for this amazing career of creative and adventurous work that has given us so much to think with and bring into our ideas about architecture for the future. I wanted to start with two images from Yasmeen's Anguribagh project in Lahore, which was completed in 1975. And the first on the left was taken in 1980, and it shows, you know, already early signs of how inhabitants are making themselves home in the architecture. There's yellow paint on the brickwork, a sign on the door, which is some sort of clinic. I can't quite make it out. I can see the word clinic, but that's about it. The second photo on the right was taken in 2019, not of the same block, but of the same building type. And you can see here how more explicitly an addition built by residents on top of the original building, a new floor, presumably for an expanding family, as well as their own additions, plaster on brickwork, but also Corinthian columns, 2 Corinthian columns holding up the new level. And I wanted to start with these images to underline an idea of architecture as process rather than architecture as product. Because in the first place, this is something that's been central to my own interests as a historian of architecture. But second, I think it's also something that's central to Yasmeen's practice, or at least has become so. And it's an idea that I explore a bit more generally in my essay, Pakistan Under Construction. And I think we can move on to the next slide there. Okay. So when discussing my possible contribution to this volume, which I was really excited to receive the invitation for, Elke and Angelica had asked me to write something that would set a wider context for Yasmeen's work in Pakistan. So not necessarily on Yasmeen's work, but on this question of what architecture as a profession looks like in Pakistan, right? How does it develop? What are its concerns? How might it help us understand the conversations that Yasmeen has been part of, but also where she is clearly forging her own path. And so rather than summarizing the chapter here, I wanted to just focus on 3 key aspects: generation, history, and authority. So on generation, Yasmeen is part of the first properly post-colonial generation of architects in Pakistan, by which I mean a cohort of architects who are born around the time of independence in South Asia, who all come of age in Pakistan, who establish their practices in the country, even if they may have been trained abroad, and also many of whom become deeply involved with projects of architectural education, as well as political or heritage activism in the country. So they're distinct, I would argue, from that generation who were trained and worked in British India and then adapted their work to the new national settings of, say, India or East or West Pakistan. So 2 things I wanted to just note about this generation. One is that they come over time to be associated with a critical engagement with international modernism. And we already saw this a little bit in Elke's slides earlier. Trained in the late 1950s and early 1960s, many of these architects were educated in the principles and practices of modernist architecture, but their work over time comes to be characterized by a skepticism towards an eventual, for some, eventual turning away from modernism. And this is in part due to wider crises in global modernism, apparent from the late 1960s and 1970s, the failures of modernist architecture to uphold its early radical promises, its appropriation as a prestige object for elite ruling classes, and also the association of modernism with authoritarian projects in Pakistan, right? Namely, under Ayub Khan and his decade of development in the 1960s. And I think that to varying degrees, architects of Yasmeen's generation became interested in, first, what is being erased, and second, who is being silenced by modernism's march towards the future. The second thing I wanted to note that is characteristic of this generation is that most of them come from places of privilege in Pakistani society. This is partially because Pakistan had no homegrown institutions for architecture after independence. So the first institution offering training in architecture was only established in 1958 in Lahore, and even then at a modest intake. So those who could become architects were those who could afford to train abroad, and many came to the UK to do so, to the Architecture Association in London, or like Yasmeen, to Oxford School of Architecture. I note this in part to say that these positions of privilege also allowed spaces for experimentation, right? The ability to take on risky or low-paying projects, to pursue one's own passions, to experiment with wealthy private clients, right? Today, members of this generation are arguably the most eminent figures in Pakistani architecture. So people like Yasmeen, but also Nair Ali Dada, Kamal Khan Mumtaz, the late Habib Fida Ali, Arif Hassan. They're now celebrated as some of the most thoughtful navigators of the built environment in this context, even if their approaches and practices are not necessarily reflected in the majority of building work in Pakistan, right? And so one of the questions that I end the essay with is, what can young architects in Pakistan today learn from this generation, even amidst such a changed context? And I argue that there is much to learn. I know I only have a few minutes left, so let me just touch briefly on two concerns that I see as common across this generation and which help us contextualize Yasmeen's work: history and authority. So on history, Pakistan was created, as you will all know, out of the partition of British India in 1947, initially as two wings, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, on either side of India. It was born out of civil war, out of the mass displacement of peoples, and the new nation was to be forged out of a community of migrants and strangers, many of whom were connected by religion, but otherwise fractured by different ethnic, linguistic, regional histories. And for this reason, many early Muslim nationalists appealed to the future as a way to bring people together, right? As Faisal Devji notes in his important book, Muslim Zion, people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah appealed to his compatriots to forget or bury the past, to start afresh, drawing on New World models of nationalism that stressed common striving and aspiration, rather than Old World certainties of shared blood and soil. So in many ways, you can see how a modernist architecture of post-colonial development might have suited this impulse, this striving or aspiration towards the future. But ultimately, history couldn't be eliminated. We know this through the various ways that ethnic and linguistic and regional distinctions have been mobilized in Pakistani history, expressed most dramatically in the liberation war fought in East Pakistan, which resulted in the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. And we also know this in the way that modernism, once promising equality, a new way of living, became associated with elitism, imposition, environmental destruction, and the eradication of earlier forms of building that were seen perhaps as more appropriate to climate, culture, context. So one of the pressing questions for architecture in Pakistan has been, does history matter? If so, which histories? How should architects engage with built heritage in their context of building? What lessons can be learned from local or vernacular approaches to architecture? What practices have survived the test of time? And I think Yasmeen's creative and path-breaking responses to these questions will be obvious from the book and the exhibition. So then just to close with this question of authority, which is linked to the above, Yasmeen, alongside many others of her generation, speak frequently about having to unlearn the principles established in their architectural education to design and build effective or appropriate architecture in Pakistan, right? So this is about the status of history in architectural education, but it's also about the notions of expertise ingrained through programs of professional training. And one of the ironies I note in my chapter is that Yasmeen is responsible first for establishing architecture as a distinct accredited profession in Pakistan. So the recognition of the architect as a qualified expert through her work in pushing for the Pakistan Council of Architects and Town Planners Ordinance in 1983. But second and simultaneously, Yasmeen has spent decades questioning the architect's role as an expert problem solver, right? A figure who comes from outside with a set of universal tools and sets out to resolve problems for people using buildings. So since Anguri Bagh, and if not earlier, Yasmeen has been someone who is increasingly interested in the architect as a listener, as an interpreter, as someone who learns from their context and from the people who will be ultimately living with the architecture they are tasked with, the architect is tasked with creating. So there's a broader interest then in this generation to rethink questions of architectural authority, and in doing so, think carefully about who architecture is for, how it will be used, and what the responsibility of the architect is not just of finishing a building, but also anticipating its futures. And I think Yasmeen has gone further than her peers in thinking about this by a long way. So just then to finish with that return to Anguri Bagh, the addition on top of that original building structure, which from one perspective could be seen as an affront to Yasmeen's design, right? Compromising its clear, uniform aesthetic. But from another perspective, is an example of the housing scheme's success, right? Its continued vitality, its evolution over time, along with the changing needs and desires of its inhabitants. And this is an important distinction, I think, in how architects face the present, and something that Yasmeen's work has been so useful for thinking about and will continue to be so into the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your insights on ambivalent relations toward modernism and what modernism has promised in terms of a different future, and how people today have a more nuanced understanding of the futures or the future created by modernism. I also really want to emphasize that the architect as listener is still an exception, even though there is a young and younger and youngest generation who is very eager to learn how to practice architecture differently, and also wants to hone qualities like empathy and listening. The mainstream production of architecture is still not based on the qualities of listening or treading lightly. I would now like to invite Marvi Maza. She's the third editor of the book, together with Angelica and myself, and also a contributing author. Marvi Maza is based in Karachi. She is an architect and practicing researcher, and she brings together spatial advocacy with the tools generated by theories and methods of visual culture. And I will just go immediately to your slide.
Thank you so much, LK and Angelica. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, Mrs. Lari. It's quite really a big day to bring this all together and talk about the work and reflect on what we've done in the last 2 years, putting this work together. So the slide that you see right now it sets a tone to a city which is a backdrop to an aspiration of 220 million population, where the skyline is a form of competitiveness and engagement with development and real estate infrastructural decisions. Now, Karachi, the largest city of Pakistan with more than 6 city centers, it's one of the problems with the built environment now that is socially agnostic and is to justify the economic principles it has come to represent. And in this chapter, I open up 3 main sections, which is, if you move on to the next slide, I look at urban ruptures, state decisions, and collective power of advocacy. It's very important to mention here that Karachi is a conglomeration of multiple religions, sects, economic divisions with increasing stratification. It has constantly restricted the emergence of social sciences, art, literature, and cultural activities. And it has also certainly been focusing on certain spatial and economic demographics of the city. And as the city is growing and expanding horizontally, the wealth is unevenly distributed. Now, this is a very strong symbolic segregation, especially associated within the city, and has led to a mindset amongst its inhabitants that generates a discourse of exclusion. It is critical, therefore, to discuss public-private partnerships in developing state projects as a form of outsourcing through corporate mechanisms. When I talk about urban ruptures, the section which concentrates on the modern mechanism of socioeconomic framework for reconstruction of Karachi, as a former employee of Heritage Foundation and a co-curator, it was important to discuss the rupturedness and lack of repair. Now, this section really focuses on understanding and also thinking of what is it to become modern, and what is it to talk about while this modernism is happening and development is taking place. There's a major section which is quite broken, and that is the first query that kind of sets the backdrop of this chapter. The second section is where developing Karachi through public-private partnerships, and these are constantly a top-down decision. This section deals with what does privatization really mean? Essentially, it is the transfer of productive public assets from state to private companies. Now, the idea of privatization is a term that defining the act of taking away and selling them as a stock to private companies, enabling the process of dispossession and violence. And I also, in my own practice, noticed that public spaces are being given out as a third-party decision. And Mrs. Lari's work questions a lot in where she's taking and intervening when it comes to publicness. And the last section where I am talking about co-learning the city, and that's the collective power of advocacy, which this section is very close to my heart and something that I keep witnessing through various tools. And here I would like to read out a certain section from the chapter where I say that learning matters. It is the fundamental right and a process of learning from within the cities, how we may think we know the city from historical referencing, but as cities change from daily interventions and use, learning transform and evolve. Learnings also have a potential to challenge and transform the way of knowing, seeing urbanism, a shift from inherited knowledge which is taken for granted. Yasmeen Lari's work is extremely important for younger generation in the built environment. Just how Climate March and Women's March are a way forward, the ethics of practice and community allyship is critical as a form of spatial advocacy. And we see that evidently through documentation, making everyday archives, and ongoing conversation with the community. So Karachi, although is constantly in the phases of building and construction, it is also a city which is learning and relearning all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mavi, for introducing us today and the readers of the book to the local context where much of Yasmeen Lari's work has been produced, not all of it in Karachi, but much of it in relation to how urbanization in Pakistan has taken off and taken place. I think you also really powerfully reminded us that architecture is always local and at the same time fully embroiled in globalized economic dynamics as they play out on the ground and materially. And lastly, I think what I also take away from what you were saying is that the architect is not only a listener, as we have learned, but through architecture, we can create forms of allyship and solidarity in order to share the ground and the built environment differently. I would now like to introduce today's last contributor out of the long list of contributors before we move to Yasmeen Lari's short lecture. Anne Karp is based in London. She's a professor of life writing and culture at London Metropolitan University. But long before I learned that she's a professor of life writing, I was familiar with her books, which in a way have a lot to do with how life can be entered into writing and how we understand what it means to be enabled to live. I was particularly impressed and inspired by her last book, How Women Can Save the Planet. And I immediately felt that Yasmeen Lari is one of the women who tries to save the planet. And that's why we reached out to you to invite you to write with and think from Yasmeen Lari's work, but also your own earlier work. And I will now hand the word to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Elke. And I'm only sorry that I didn't know I had read about Yasmeen Lari, but I didn't know enough about her work when I was writing that book, because obviously she would have figured prominently. I asked myself a question before this session and before I wrote my contribution to the book, which is that Yasmeen Lari calls herself an activist architect. And is that feminist architecture by another name? And I ask that question a little bit reluctantly because I know how confining and limiting labels can be. And I didn't want to impose one on Yasmeen Lari. And also, there seemed something not quite right about claiming her, for ourselves, as it were. So I'm not arguing that from the point of view of a label, but more whether we can view her through that lens and whether that enables us to think about her in a slightly different way. And I'm not calling her a feminist architect because she was the first female architect in Pakistan, because if Margaret Thatcher taught us anything, it's that being the first female of anything does not necessarily mean that you have women's interests at heart. And there also are alternative models of architecture. So for me, what I understand by feminist architecture very often takes the form of collectives, of professional collectives, like there was one in the UK called Matrix some time ago, or there's Architecture Sans Frontières, where groups go together and try and reconfigure the professional-client relationship and work in a different way. But for me, the main reasons, the three reasons why I would like us to think about Yasmeen Architecture's work as feminist architecture is, first of all, what she does in the way of repositioning women's care work. And here we've got the chulas that really are a brilliant example of that. So if we think about care work, which is essentially the reproduction of daily life, so childcare, elder care, shopping, cooking, cleaning, laundry. These tasks, we know, in almost every culture are gendered. They sustain production. They are mostly done by women, and they're hidden. Someone called them a free subsidy given to people in power. So in other words, they enable the reproduction of power and the reproduction of production, but they are never credited. They're clandestine. And this is reflected in the layout of, certainly in the global north, of domestic architecture, so that those sites, those locations where that work takes place, namely usually the kitchen and the laundry, or if there's a utility room, they're sited at the rim of the house. And only recently has that been challenged for them to become the center of the house. They're positioned so that those activities take place away from public view. And what excited me so much when I looked at these chulas is, well, many things. Obviously, the fact that it helps women become healthier because of the fewer emissions, but also precisely because it makes this work visible and makes it less isolated. And there seemed something so neat about the fact that the chula elevates women, their work, both literally as well as metaphorically. It actually brings it out into the open. It makes the task of cooking visible, and it makes it social. So it takes it from the private sphere into the public sphere. And I think this is a remarkable and really exciting development. Then, of course, is the fact that her work is at the moment so low cost, low waste, low carbon, moving towards zero waste and zero carbon, using vernacular materials like lime, bamboo, mud and stone, and methods. Now, I'm not claiming this as feminist because in any sense that I'm arguing that women have some innate innate sense of caring for the natural world and caring for the planet. I don't believe that. I believe that there are women who are quite ruthless in their extractive impulses in the same as men, if they are given the opportunity. But I do think that women all too often find themselves, for example, after climate-induced extreme events like floods and drought, having to start everything up again and recreate the home. That task falls to women, either in emergency shelters or in places where their houses and their residences have been ravaged, and that produces an understanding, a situated understanding, if you like, of the consequence of risk and the consequences of overriding the Earth's natural limits. So I think that arises from women's lived experience and the need and the responsibilities placed on women to rebuild after catastrophe. And so this relationship that Yasmeen Lari has with natural resources seems to me an alternative to extractive, exploitative relationships. And I would argue that that is intrinsically a feminist way of working. And finally, I see her work as the participatory architecture that she works with as a kind of reparative architecture that enables women, marginalized women, non-literate women, to develop some measure of control over their lives and become co-creators of buildings. And what I love about this is, we tend to think of professions. In fact, if you look at the history of professions, they developed as kind of craft guilds to keep other people out, to hoard privileges, as well as to develop, obviously, particular skills. And Yasmeen Lari doesn't do that in her work. She is doing the opposite. And I'm very loath usually to use the word empower because it's become such a debased word. But I do think that this is a good use of it because she is empowering the women she works with. She's encouraging self-reliance and she's teaching them skills that enable them to become self-reliant. And those are skills that they can then pass on to other women. So it becomes a chain that constantly reproduces itself and enlarges the number of women with these skills. So I hope she'll forgive me if I salute her, not just for her extraordinary work, and not just as a feminist architect, but even as an eco-feminist work. And I'm very privileged to have been in this gathering today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing with us what is a future enabling eco-feminist architecture that brings people in rather than keeping them out. And I think there was a third term adding to solidarity, allyship, the architect as listener, which is reparative architecture, which I really find very, very important to think about Yasmeen Lari's work. Yasmeen, it's a great honor that you have agreed to also speak yourself at the book launch. And we are very much looking forward to hearing your voice. And thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, and my friends Angelica and LK, and of course Chris, who I haven't met for a long time, but I've known him for a long time, and of course Mari from Karachi, and Anne. It's so good to meet you. I'd not met you before, but I would love to meet you when I come to London sometime, if you're there. So thank you so much. And really, it's overwhelming for me what you guys are saying and you're thinking. And it just, in a sense, strengthens my resolve to do more if I can. I need to do more because we're in deep trouble right now in my own country. So, but how wonderful for me to be once again part of a great initiative driven by my friends, Professor Dr. Elke Krasny and Museum Director Angelika Fitz, who for many years have been in the forefront to work out ways to heal the planet. In the early 2000s, they began to focus on ecologically driven themes that resulted in the publication of a collection of essays edited by them that were mentioned, Critical Care, Architecture and Urbanism for a Broken Planet, along with an exhibition of relevant works at the Architecture Museum, Vienna, as part of Vienna Biennale. I can never say the Architecture Zentrum, I can never say it right. So if you forgive me, I'll just say AZW the next time. This is when I first had the privilege of being invited and was able to discuss methodologies for stitching the frayed tapestry of the planet. These were themes which had not yet become mainstream somehow. I'm so grateful to curators Angelika Fitz and Professor Elke Krasny for their research and dedication over several years now, and for the organization of the exhibition of my work by them and their team in Vienna, and our own Marvi Mazhar in Karachi, who transported my whole world, my work, my life through innovative displays of pictures, graphics, as well as videos and interviews of women such as Champa, who was once marginalized, but today she's a barefoot millionaire, who, through her extraordinary effort for guiding self-build of 45,000 units of the, and championed the world-famous zero-carbon earthen Pakistan chula stoves. She's done a phenomenal job and she's still busy doing that. All exhibited in that wonderful space of AZW, a one-time royal stables, with its magnificent simplicity of exhibition space, oozing authenticity. I love the place. It's just so good. As if that was not enough, through their own scholarly writings and the collection of essays by other eminent scholars and historians from across the world like yourselves, they compiled the book Yasmeen Lari, Architecture for the Future, the second edition of which is being launched today by world-famous publishing house MIT Press. My warm thanks to the publishers for the devoted way with which the book of social and ecological relevance has been published. So thank you, Victoria and colleagues, for all your hard work. We know that we are at crossroads today. This first quarter of 21st century presents a world full of disruptions, disparities, and rising poverty levels, where on one hand, 1.6 billion people do not have access to adequate shelter, and 1 in 9 goes hungry every night. And on the other hand, it is the same world in which so many continue to indulge in excessive consumption, in eco-bigotry and flaunting of wealth through practices that are hurtful to the planet. For me, it is gratifying to see a wind of change blowing through my own profession. With one stroke, the selection committee of the Royal Institute of British Architects and the British monarch himself, by giving their consent to their coveted Architectural Royal Medal, have acknowledged the relevance of architecture developed for barefoot approaches once considered divergent vagabond pathway. This decision has expanded the canvas for young professionals and legitimized our agenda for decolonization and decarbonization of the built environment, as Elke mentioned, and giving agency and dignity to the marginalized through architecture. The message of solidarity and optimism that I continue to receive since 27th April, when the prize was announced, from people from all walks of life, from richly endowed entities to the poorest and the remotest of villages, from eminent as well as young professionals around the world, fill me with hope for the future of our planet. All of us who are joining this webinar today are part of the same league of warriors, I believe, who are working towards a changed world order, to help fashion a world that holds dear the principles of egalitarianism and inclusiveness, where the most downtrodden could be enabled agency by acknowledging and nurturing the importance of design driven by their own cultural roots. And most importantly, where together we could promote methodologies for the critical care needed for our planet. Today, thousands of marginalized women who had just last year experienced the most devastating flood in my country have risen to express their optimism and hope through patterns they're inscribing on earth-rendered walls everywhere, a creative process that they have inherited from their mothers and their mothers before them. It's come through generations. We know that this rich tradition has always given agency to even the most oppressed in so many countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. But never before have they had the large canvas that they have themselves fashioned as a result of the recent devastation by building hundreds of thousands of zero-carbon earth structures for safety from floodwaters and for their own use to endow themselves with dignity. Whether it's the earthen-raised Pakistan chula stove or platforms for dining or for keeping food and water safe and raised beds for kitchen gardens, each built using the ubiquitous earth, which has been the most important construction material for the marginalized since time immemorial. It's always been there. It is these earthen structures where every surface lends itself to being ornamented with creative renderings, each one turning into a spectacular work of art. With displacement of 33 million people, my country, Pakistan, is confronted with an unprecedented challenge. Almost 3 million families need to be rehabilitated. In the country, the international colonial charity model has again come to play, obviously, through World Bank. Again, loans. Once again, promoting dependence by treating affected communities as victims. The distribution of cash handouts is accompanied with promotion of expensive alien models with high carbon footprint, thus continuing to aggravate emissions whenever the state is able to begin the process of delivery. It's not done so far. So far, there's little show on the ground, even though 8.5 months have passed by since the disaster. But money is being distributed. We don't know where it'll go, what will happen. In contrast, through application of humanistic humanitarianism fostered by Baza or Barefoot Social Architecture since September 2022, Heritage Foundation of Pakistan, at a cost of $90 to $150 per family, has enabled more than 4,500 families to be rehabilitated. Of course, I realize this is but a drop in the ocean. Since I have announced my resolve to implement rehabilitation of 1 million families in 2 years, I found that my target, which appears ambitious, can actually be achieved if the process is conducted by the people for the people. We don't have to rely on anybody else. Since last month, I've adopted the zero donor strategy, zero donor, no money from anywhere, which is designed to utilize meager resources and labor of the destitute to attain food security and basic needs. The methodology relies on brigades of a host of trained barefoot eco-entrepreneurs, or our BEEs, each with particular specialization, who are fanning out village after village and sharing their knowledge and expertise at a small fee, like Champa has done earlier. So it's the Champa model being replicated, but on a very large scale. All items that are being promoted by them are affordable, using locally sourced materials and designed to fulfill the unmet needs of the vast numbers that have been bereft since last September. They've had nothing, not even food. This includes one-room houses and eco-toilets, each costing less than $15, built within 3 months by household themselves. I had to come up with a solution. I had to make sure that they would be safe and they can pay for it themselves. And I think we're on our way. And since they all acquire knowledge from BEEs incrementally, they will be able to do that. The results of the last month are promising, giving me hope to achieve the target by training 2 barefoot brigades of BEEs each month. There's something like 28 in each one of the brigades. And each brigade reaching 6,000 households every month. So hopefully within 12 months, if you're on track, we'll make it. Thus, my plea to aid giving and donor agencies is to adopt a new humanitarian culture, which places emphasis on skill training, capacity building, and developing enabling environments to foster low carbon or net zero carbon methodologies. A humanistic culture that replaces the cycle of dependency with a culture of self-reliance. Recent disasters, whether Pakistan's devastating flood or the tragic Turkey-Syria earthquake within 6 months of each other, we mustn't forget that it's happening so often, highlight the seriousness with which all countries need to prepare for dealing with climate change. It's not only Pakistan, it's not the ones who are most vulnerable. Everybody is likely to become vulnerable at some time or the other, and we must prepare for that. We need to be aware that 39 to 40% of all emissions are due to conventional construction. So most of us working in the built environment are really, they really carry a huge responsibility. And urban centers being responsible for 65 to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. will remain global warming battlegrounds, with more and more cities suffering from urban flooding and urban heat islands. We're seeing it everywhere now. So I would like to see many recent movements to take root, such as degrowth for curtailing capitalism-driven expansion, and transition design to encourage adoption of more sustainable lifestyles, along with eco-urbanism that emphasizes the need for curtailed vehicular movement, lowered urban densities, and increased urban forestation. Adoption of traditional urbanism to create humanistic environments, drawn from medieval cities of Asia and Europe. They still exist, they're still there. We just have to look deep there, that's it. Also, application of sponge city concepts to conserve and absorb floodwaters into the soil in order to replenish aquifers on a regular basis. All the flooding that we have, that goes on every year with us, if we could just work out the system to absorb as much as we could, we will mitigate the effect. It won't be as bad. I know that we won't solve it, but I think, we could at least minimize the damage. So I would like to see application of tenets of Baza promoting 4 zeros: zero carbon, zero waste, zero donor, leading to zero poverty. I think it can happen by itself. And the application of 3 no's: no to handouts, no to concrete, no to steel. In conclusion, my appeal is for all of us to join forces to actualize the dream of a humanistic and egalitarian world, fashioned with carbon neutral environments for the benefit of our future generations. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmeen, for sharing with us.
Thank you.
And for insisting on triple no's that can result in yes to a planet in need of healing. Before I give Angelica the word to have the last word in today's session, I would just like to emphasize that I think all the 3 of us as editors, Marvi, Angelica, and myself, we believe that books can actually not only convey and disseminate and carry on knowledge, but can also inspire hope and being with the planet otherwise. And of course, we know that books need places and homes and bodies and minds to belong to. So what we wish for this book to happen is to be at home in many places, in homes, in offices, in studios, in the subway, in the countryside, in universities, in order to do the job this book has come into the world to do, to help unlearn and to help relearn.
Thanks a lot, Elke, and special thanks to you, Yasmeen. It's a privilege to listen to you, and it has been a privilege working on this project. So thanks again for your generosity. So we learned such a lot, and we also getting such a lot of hope out of it. That's also what working in a museum, communicating to a broad public, especially during the last couple of years, we could really feel that many people lost confidence, and understandable that we can still kind of manage, that's a strange word, that we can escape the catastrophe, because it's also catastrophic, and there's no light on the horizon, and it's so important to show exhibitions and to publish books of what one calls the next practice or best practice or whatever, but just to show architecture for the future, I think, and people are really moved. And maybe Lene, I would like to thank to you. There is a colleague from our team in the background, Lene Benz, and maybe you could share the screen again and just show us quickly, as Yasmeen also mentioned the exhibition, just that you get an idea of our space and about how the exhibition looks like. Thanks a lot, Elke. So this is our space. It's a Baroque space. It's the royal horse stables, as Yasmeen was mentioning, with a brick building, and the way our scenographer and the graphic designer conceptualized scenography was in a very simple way. So it's made of local materials, of course, not Pakistani materials, but European materials. It's made out of wood, which is very sustainable in Austria, and out of fabric. And we are printing on the fabric. We are showing videos on the fabric, and we are also creating a kind of a community situation. And I think a very much situations where people can really make a temporary home in the exhibition. So people really like to spend their time in the exhibition and to read carefully and to talk to other people. And we have a lot of guided tours. So if any one of you happens to be near Vienna, please come to our museum and just have a look. But I'm very happy that now the exhibition will have a second life through the book, and it's just the start now. So the international launch of the book was yesterday, and we launched it today through our presentation. And so it has also been a privilege to work with all the authors. So thanks especially again to the two of you and Chris, who joined today, but to all of them. Maybe some of them are listening. And yeah, as Elke said already, I wish the book a long life and intensive life. Thanks a lot to everyone. And maybe one last thing, we are recording, we recorded the whole session, so it will be on our media channel in a few days. So if you want to recommend it to some other people, please do through the museum's webpage. It can be accessed.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you. Bye then. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.